Our theme for the 1993 Institute is Africa, Old Myths and New Realities. Again, I'd like to encourage anyone who hasn't picked up a brochure to pick one up. There's some there available at the door entrance. In the brochure, you will notice the excellent lineup of speakers we have for the rest of the week. I just want to encourage you to attend as many lectures as possible. Tomorrow there will be a lecture at noon in the gallery. The rest of the noon lectures are here in the Pioneer Room, but tomorrow's lecture on why the U.S. should invest in Africa is in the gallery. Also would encourage you to attend this evening's lecture. We're very honored to have Randall Robinson, who is founder and executive director of Trans Africa. He will be speaking as our keynote speaker tonight on Africa, Old Myths and New Realities. And that will be in the Sunroom at 8 o'clock. But today, we're pleased to have a very important lecturer. This man was someone who I met just about 10 years ago. 10 years ago in October was the U.S. invasion of Grenada. And at that time, I was a student here, I still am, and we had a number of protests and activities against that invasion. And we were pleased to have our speaker today come in January of 1984 to address the issue of the U.S. invasion of Grenada and to raise some of the violations of human rights and international law that occurred because of that invasion. So I was pleased to meet him at that time, and I'm pleased to have him come back here 10 years later to address us for this institute. Our speaker is Lennox Hines. He is legal counsel for the African National Congress and the Republic of Namibia. He also serves as a permanent representative for the United Nations for International Association for Democratic Lawyers. He is an attorney and senior partner in Stevens, Hines & White, and also professor of law and chairman of the Administration of Justice Department at Rutgers University. He's an author and an expert on international humanitarian law, and one of his books is Illusions of Justice, Human Rights Violations in the United States. Let's give an opening welcome to our Monday noon speaker, Lennox Hines.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like to express my appreciation to the Institute on World Affairs and to the student government at Iowa State University for inviting me here to speak to you. As Jim pointed out, I was here roughly 10 years ago, and at that time, I was one of the lawyers who sued the United States government, sued then President Ronnie the Actor Reagan and his Secretary of Defense then, Caspar Weinberger. Now, we sued then not because we actually believed that there was any federal district court judge who had any intentions of progressing in his career, who would uphold an injunction to enjoin the President of the United States. But we sued because we felt that something had to be done to deal with the question of law and order within the White House. And we sued because we felt that it was important that members of Congress who felt that the president was acting ultra vires, that is beyond the scope of his authority, ought to be challenged in our courts. Of course, the federal district court judge simply ruled that the matter was non-justiciable. That is a way of the courts skirting the issue. They said, well, this was a political question. You go to the Congress. If the Congress wants to, in fact, muzzle the president with respect to the War Powers Act, then they can do that, but don't use the courts. I'm pleased, though, to be here to speak to you today on another topic related in some way, and that is on international law and U.S. intervention in Africa. Many of us looked with a degree of horror when we saw starving children in Somalia. You saw these youngsters covered in flies, disease-ridden, and you saw people literally starving before our eyes on national television. And we said, what can we do about it? How can we help? I'm reminded that I'm standing here in Iowa, known to us in the East as the part of the breadbasket of America in the Midwest. I was driving on your highway from Omaha here, and I saw those rolling terraced fields that give abundant crops here in the United States. And so the question is, how can we help? And so George E. Bush, in one of his last acts, dispatched troops. And so if you were asked on one of your quizzes in your Political Science 101B, why are U.S. troops in Somalia? How would you answer? Is it to help starving children, to feed the starving masses? I'm not asking you to respond. This is a rhetorical question. As in all of our military incursions and mobilizations, we at home wave banners, we wave our American flags, and with a burst of patriotic pride, we pat our breasts, and we deal with the generosity of the United States, the compassion and the courage of our troops. And we did so as our troops landed on the beaches of Mogadishu, and as we paraded up onto the beaches and onto the beachhead then in Mogadishu. But what are the legal and humanitarian principles that form the basis for our third world incursions? Under what premise do we proceed? And there's been a mixed bag. We intruded and invaded the small island of Grenada, and we used then a pretext. We said that that small patch of land in the Caribbean was a threat to the United States national interest. We said that at that time we felt an airport was being built which would in fact be used as a launching pad to incursions in the Caribbean and in other areas that we said we had a vested interest. Our fallback position was some medical students who were studying in Grenada. And we proceeded to topple a government that clearly we disagreed with. But there was another intervention in this hemisphere a few years later, and that was in Panama We sacrificed some of our American youth and hundreds of Panamanians. One theory was that we had a young Marine and his wife who were accosted, and we were about to avenge the honor of this Marine and his wife. But the next theory that we advanced was that we launched an invasion in order to arrest a drug dealer called Manuel Noriega. Now, Manuel Noriega was on the payroll of the CIA. He was our man in Panama until something changed, until he became uncontrollable, until he began to do what others have done, operate in their interests, and not necessarily being under the direct control of the United States. And so our interest in the Panama Canal was threatened. In the Gulf War, we conned the American public in thinking that what we were doing is we were attempting to do what? Liberate Kuwait. Now, Kuwait was a creation of the British. They carved or drew a line in the sand, created that entity. And I'm not here as an advocate for Saddam when he argues that Kuwait, in fact, was just a greater Baghdad. But the fact of the matter is, we created Saddam, we supported him militarily, and even today there is a call for congressional hearings on how we, in fact, supported Saddam, armed him to the teeth, because at that time we were concerned about whom? The Ayatollah. That's right. We were concerned about the Ayatollah, and we felt that what we had to do was to arm Iraq, because in terms of the lesser of two evils, we in fact were bidding on Saddam. Of course, Saddam used those same weapons against us. The geostrategic interest that we had was to, of course, control the Persian Gulf. Now, sending 20,000 troops to Somalia to feed starving children and adults seems like a humanitarian act. But as we will discuss today, it is only one of the most recent incursions by the United States in Africa, and it is also the most recent interference in Africa made possible by the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which provided a balance between our interests and that of the socialist bloc. And now we have a unipolar world where the vision of the world order is seen through the spectacles worn by the United States. And that may be cool if, in fact, that those spectacles are, in fact, guided and provide a basis under international law that we can support. Now, I will be talking about certain concepts of international law within the short time available to us today. And I'd like to provide a brief review of U.S. foreign policy in Africa since the end of World War II. That is, a foreign policy in contravention of domestic law and a contravention of international law. Now, I'm focusing on Somalia as a paradigm of the continuing consequences of United States Cold War foreign policies, which were grafted onto a colonial policies of the former European empire builders. Prior to 1990, our foreign policy, that is United States foreign policy in Africa, was undertaken as a means to solve non-African problems. At that time, prior to 1990, it was characterized by our preoccupation of what the Soviet Union would do, the spread of communism, and our concern about preserving Africa and preserving the interest in Africa, political and economic, for our Western allies. And that is why the United States voted against every resolution at the United Nations calling for the rights of self-determination in Africa. Every single resolution. And so those countries such as Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, who were fighting for their independence, the United States position was to oppose that. Why? Because we were supporting who? The Portuguese, our NATO allies. And when the people of then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was struggling for their independence, the United States would not support those struggles for national liberation. We voted against it. And so, if you look, north of the Sahara, south of the Sahara, the history has been the same. Been the same in Namibia, been the same in South Africa. And so, we have, in terms of our foreign policy, been concerned about the maintenance of transnational control of the rich resources of the continent. We have used a number of methods in order to protect our interests, not the least of which has been the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States government, the CIA. Documentation of the CIA involvement in the African continent is unimpeachable since the end of World War II. And I would suggest that some of you who would like to do some research and to read into this, you should see, for example, a book entitled Dirty Works 2, The CIA in Africa, authored by Lyle Stewart, 1980, and with editors Ray et al. Should also see W. Blum, The CIA, A Forgotten History, published by Zed in 1986, and another book by J. Rainlaw, the agency, the rise and decline of the CIA, 1986. Now, in 1976, the CIA backed and the United States, part of the United States foreign policy, condoned mercenaries in Angola. Now, I happened to be in Angola in 1976 when 3 Americans were tried as mercenaries. I happened to be part of an international team of legal experts who were witnessing the trial. Now, these were individuals they weren't only Americans. There were 3 Americans. There were about 2 or 3 British mercenaries. There were some Belgians, some Italians, some French. They were recruited here in the United States in violation of domestic law. That is the Neutrality Act, codified in U.S. law as Title 18, Section 961 et al. Now, that law says that it is illegal for any person in the United States to launch an invasion, to start an expedition here in the United States against a country at which the United States has not declared war. Now, there are a number of individuals who have been persecuted in this regard, and a number of others who have had shelter. In the Angolan context, a magazine called Soldier of Fortune magazine was used. This magazine advertised, recruited young people, offering them adventure, offering them pay, offering them challenges, offering them glory to fight abroad. Many of those individuals were former special forces, and we believe that they were part of a CIA activity where special forces members resigned from the special forces and then were recruited as individual contractors fighting for the highest bidder. Well, these individuals were arrested and were brought to trial, and I was there. Their defense was that the practice of mercenarism was not a crime, not a recognized crime, and therefore the Angolan government had no jurisdiction to try them. I thought, not only do I practice international law, but I'm a criminal trial lawyer. I thought that was a silly argument to make. And I thought of these young men who were facing a firing squad, to have some American lawyers to come over there and to make that argument to these Angolans who had captured these fellows. Well, that was one lawyer's argument. Another lawyer's argument I thought was more creative and probably more along the lines. He said, look, my client did not know what was going on. He read an ad, and in fact, he was simply a cook. Well, the problem with that was that this fellow, when he was arrested, had an M1 across his shoulder. And he was doing more than simply cooking. But I thought that one way of trying to exculpate the situation would be to not to take on an argument saying that the government did not have the legal authority to try these people who were caught on their land with crisp United States dollars in their pocket, plundering their country. The ravages of what transpired in Angola, mid-1970s, continues to today. Continues to today with the United States supported and inspired UNITA under the direction of Jonas Savimbi. Well, let's look at another country, in Zaire. In '84, there was a confidential memorandum smuggled out of Zaire, which revealed that representatives of the United States and the apartheid regime in South Africa made possible by the end of that period, had met, that is, the United States representatives of the South African regime, had met with UNITA leaders to plan the destabilization of Angola. So here the United States was using Zaire as a country through which they would proceed to use agents to destabilize Angola. But that is not the only relationship between the CIA and the Bureau of State Security for South Africa. They have been described as being thick as thieves. The fact of the matter is, the CIA provided information which resulted in Nelson Mandela being arrested and imprisoned. And it was very moving for me as Mandela's lawyer in the United States when he traveled to the United States in 1990, that this man who spent 27 years in prison did not want to make a single negative statement against the United States and those people who had assisted in his capture and imprisonment. And you recall that Georgie Bush at one time was the director of the CIA. But there is a close relationship between the Bureau of State Security in South Africa and the CIA, drawn together by their mutual interests, their political conservatism, and their racism. The CIA and BOSS established an old boys network of cooperation and information exchange. Their shared racism and politics led to Henry Kissinger's strategy called the tar baby option. That was included in a 1969 National Security Memorandum entitled Memorandum Number 39. The tar baby option was based on the premise that whites in South Africa were there to stay, and that the only vehicle for change was the white minority. And there was no hope for the black majority to gain their political rights except by violence, which would lead to chaos and increase opportunities for the communists. But now that analysis was made in '69. Within 5 years, the liberation movements of Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola had prevailed. The MPLA, the PAIGC, Frelimo had won on the battlefields, had defeated the Portuguese. The struggles in Zimbabwe and Namibia had escalated and the ANC-led armed struggle had accelerated in South Africa. Now, responding to those events, the CIA and the United States State Department increased overt and covert aid to the racist forces attempting to maintain neo-colonialism in Southern Africa. As far back in the 1960s, the US foreign policy in Africa was clear. When the Congo won its independence from Belgium and formed the Democratic Coalition, headed by Patrice Lumumba in the country, which was then called Zaire, the CIA moved in. When Lumumba came to the United States, and Dwight Eisenhower met him. On the one hand, Eisenhower was greeting him. On the other hand, he was saying, this guy's a communist, get rid of him. Within a few weeks, the CIA was deeply involved in efforts to overthrow the government and to assassinate some of the top officials. And you have to read the Senate report, the United States Senate report on intelligence dealing with covert actions to overthrow foreign governments, to see the substantiation of the United States government plans to assassinate certain foreign leaders. Soon after independence, the Congolese army mutinied. Belgian troops reoccupied the country and organized the secession of the mineral-rich Katanga province. Lumumba called upon the UN to help reorganize the army and to remove the Belgians. The UN, supported by the Eisenhower administration, delayed in replacing the Belgian troops and refused to oppose the Katanga secession. Since the Soviet Union offered to assist Lumumba, the CIA financed and counsels Lumumba's enemies, resulting in his assassination in January of 1961. Thereafter, a United States-sponsored and sustained regime was established in Zaire under the leadership of Mobutu, who is there today. And Mobutu provided the support and covert support from Zaire against Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique for the next 30 years. Seymour Hersh in the New York Times documented the crucial role of the CIA in advising and supporting resident army officers who overthrew President Nkrumah in Ghana in 1966. All of these documented covert interventions and many more, which time prevents us from considering, wreaked havoc upon the black majority people in Africa and provided the justification for US foreign policies in Africa. The consequences of these policies, illegal in international and domestic law, forged in the heat of the Cold War, affect current policies, even those presumably motivated by humanitarian principles. How did an operation that brought American soldiers in Somalia to feed starving people wind up with American soldiers' corpses being dragged through the streets of Somalia? How did this little country in the Horn become the candidate for the Beirut or the Vietnam of the 1990s? The roots of the disaster of Somalia, I contend, are deep in the tormented history of the exploitation of Africa by European colonial powers. Somalia is a country artificially created by the merger of a British Somaliland protectorate and the UN trusteeship territory of Somalia in July of 1960. It is located on the Horn of Africa, bordering Ethiopia to the east and the south. It is one of the least developed countries in the world. It has a per capita annual income of $280. 75% of the country's approximately 5.8 million are nomads, the majority of whom are divided into 4 main clans. Now, how did such a poor little country in a poor region attract the attention of the great powers, and especially the United States of America? The answer, my friends, is geography. That is strategic geographic concerns. The Horn of Africa is strategically located between the southern mouth of the Red Sea, near the Strait of Bab el-Mandab, and across from the Arabian Peninsula, providing a prime spot from which power and rare area support for military intervention in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf can be launched. American policymakers feared a hostile takeover of the Horn of Africa would destabilize pro-Western governments in the Middle East, that it would interrupt commercial shipping lanes leading out of the Indian Ocean to the west, and cut off Western access to Middle Eastern ports. For these geopolitical reasons, the U.S. involved itself deeply in the affairs of Ethiopia, in continually shifting power relations arising from American-Soviet competition in Africa. In 1969, General Mohammed Said Bayer seized power in Somalia and established a close relationship with the Soviet Union. Somalia maintained these close relations until Ethiopia, with Soviet assistance, defeated Somalia in the Ogden War. In March of 1978, the Ethiopians, supplied by the Soviet Union, defeated Somalia. The U.S. became Somalia's principal ally. Prior to that, the Soviet Union poured billions of dollars of arms into Somalia. The United States was supporting Haile Selassie. And even though the Eritreans were fighting for self-determination, the United States supported Selassie against the Eritreans and said that they had no rights to self-determination because we were concerned with what? Our geopolitical interests. With Ethiopia turning to the Soviet Union, we shift sides. We now started pouring arms into Somalia, never really pouring money to assist the people in that area, to build up any structures. We were only concerned with what? Protecting our economic interests through what means? The force of arms. Ironically, as quietly as it's kept, those same arms are being used to kill whom? You got it right. Us. And of course, our interests at this point, partly humanitarian, but like a boomerang, what goes around comes around, and we are getting caught. In 1988, there were tremendous human rights abuses in Somalia. The United States, ignoring the fact that thousands of Somalis were being killed, hundreds were jailed, we continued to pour money and supported the Somali national movement and the government there. The torture and murder of civilians by government forces, armed with US weapons, has been documented. As a result of the civil war, more than 300,000 Somalis walked across the border into Ethiopia, which itself was being racked by bloodshed and drought. The United States State Department ignored the institutionalized nature of the human rights violations by the Somali regime and pressed Congress to release more economic aid in the face of mounting evidence of a persistent pattern of gross humanitarian intervention. The Bush-Reagan administration justified these disproportionate aid levels by citing Somalia's strategic geographic placement in the area. You're talking about $20 million was appropriated, asked by Congress to appropriate to Somalia, which represented 25% of all US economic support funds for Africa, excluding Egypt. Now that is a small pittance when you consider $80 million. The United States supports Israel to the tune of over $3 million per day. All of Africa, $80 million, with the exception of Egypt. Now, this is the New World Order in which US troops, under the UN flag, in a so-called UN mission with shifting goals, is in Somalia. The same New World Order which introduced the people of the United States to the convenience of the clean weekend war in the Persian Gulf and in other places. First Grenada, then Panama, and then, of course, Bush graduated to the presidency, the Gulf War. Now we are stuck in Somalia and considering intervention in Bosnia, and as always, we are on the sidelines standing by while the people of Haiti are being slaughtered. So what is a rule in of law in contemporary society that we ought to be dealing with? What is the legitimate legal justification for the imposition of control by one state against another? We began this discussion by positing that a state like the United States enjoying the benefits of existing international relations should be motivated to uphold international law and should build and create effective international organizations for the peaceful settlement of interstate disputes. Therefore, since the United States stands at the pinnacle of world influence, it should abandon the discredited principles of customary law, which are relics, I maintain, of the 19th century gunboat diplomacy. The dubious, discredited practices engaged in the United States in Africa as foreign policy and decision-making, which we have included, involves retaliation, reprisals, military intervention, counter-intervention, destabilization, and humanitarian intervention. These are relics of a policy of empire building, and we maintain must yield to the post-UN Charter norms of international law. When major powers, those such as the United States, threaten or use force or economic coercion for reasons not explicitly sanctioned by contemporary standards of international law, formally accepted by all states of the world community, then these powers undermine the integrity of the very international legal order which they constructed to protect their vital national interests in the first place. In the contemporary world, as we approach the third millennium the only legitimate justification and procedures for the perpetuation of violence or coercion by one state against another are those set forth in the United Nations Charter. These include and are limited to the rights of individual and collective self-defense in the event of an armed attack, as prescribed by Article 51, or Chapter 7 enforcement actions by the UN Security Council, or Chapter 8 enforcement actions by the appropriate regional organization acting with the authorization of the Security Council under Article 53 of the Charter. Peacekeeping operations organized under the auspices of the UN General Assembly in accordance with the Uniting for Peace resolution, or by the relevant regional organizations acting in conformity with their constitutional procedures subject to the overall supervision of the UN Security Council, as defined in the chapters and articles of